I've been using alcohol markers for so long now that I forgot how regular markers worked, so when I found this pack of old markers in my basement, I thought I'd give it a try. The first thing I noticed was how much they saturate the paper. Like, you go over it a couple of times and it's just totally saturated. It's really hard to get an even layer. It ends up kind of blotchy. And to be honest, I didn't even really notice the difference between alcohol markers and regular markers until I went back to regular markers. Something I noticed that was really interesting is that regular markers saturate the paper, but they don't actually bleed through the paper as much as alcohol markers do. So out of all these markers, I only had one marker that was actually an alcohol marker, and that's the one that bled through the paper. But it's also the one that gave me the most even, beautiful tone across the entire thing, and you'll see it here with this flower. This is the only alcohol marker in the whole bunch, and it, even though I'm going over it several times, it still gives a really even color. I also noticed with the regular markers that I didn't have as much control. I went over the lines a little bit more than I normally would. Now I don't know if that would be the same with all regular markers or if it's just this type of tip, but the tips were just, you can see it here, the tips are just very floppy. And I found it really hard to control, so I had to go over and had to be very gentle with my markers. But the cool thing was I discovered on the other side there was this tiny little tip that I could use for little details, which with the alcohol markers that I don't have that much control with the tiny tip. But if you go over the paper, and you can see that here, if you go over it quite a bit, it kind of rips up the paper a little bit, so that I don't really like. And here I'm finishing up the lips, which is my favorite part. And again, I didn't have a lot of control with this marker, so I went over the line a little bit, but I fixed it in the end. If you like this Day of the Dead coloring book, you can find it at the link in my bio. Here's the finished piece.